Thanks, Chavda. Good evening, everyone. So our topic for today is cesarean section. Okay, can somebody tell me the correct spelling for cesarean? I'm starting off my today's series with a question. So anybody can type in the correct spelling for cesarean? Yeah, Caesarean is one spelling. Yes. Any other spelling? Yes, Caesar. Yes, Cesarean. Okay, so these are the two spellings. What I have written here is simply to confuse you. This is not the correct spelling. So it's either Caesarean or there is one spelling in UK English, another one in American. The other one is Cesarean. Okay, so there are two spellings for cesarean section. Next slide, please. Okay, so what is cesarean section? It's an operative procedure whereby the fetuses, after the end of 28 weeks, are delivered through an incision on the abdominal and uterine walls. Okay, so there are two parts of this definition which are important. One is end of 28 weeks, and another one is incision on the uterine wall. Okay, so if you deliver a baby before viability, before the end of 28 weeks, okay, it is not called as a cesarean section. What do you call that operative procedure? Anybody? All the steps are the same, but the only thing is the baby is maybe around 25 weeks or 24 weeks. Okay, now this 28 weeks was taken as the period of viability beyond which it can survive. Termination of pregnancy, anything better can it be called? Termination of pregnancy can be like through vaginal route also. So what is a better terminology? Not hysterectomy. Somewhere close, Suraj. Preterm, no. Cesarean section is called preterm cesarean if it is done between 28 weeks and 37 weeks. It's not called preterm cesarean. So if the same operative procedure, you do it before 28 weeks, it is called as hysterotomy. Yes, it is called as hysterotomy. So hysterotomy is a method of second trimester abortion. Like after 18 weeks, and you've tried all possible medical methods, mifepristone, misoprostol, you've tried Foley's catheter, and then finally you can't abort the baby, then you do a hysterotomy. Okay, that is so before the end of 28th week, the same procedure when you do, it is not called as a cesarean section, it is called as a hysterotomy. Okay, just to cut down the uterus and delivering a baby which is not viable, which is not capable of independent survival from the mother. This 28-week cutoff is telling us that the baby is capable of independent survival. Another confusion I've seen among students is when the examiner asks at how many weeks will you do a cesarean section, so most of them tell 28 weeks because that is the definition of cesarean section. So that is not the right answer. So what is the best time to do a cesarean section? It is called cesarean section if you do it after 28 weeks. Any time after 28 weeks, you can call it a cesarean section. But at how many weeks is the best time to do a cesarean section? Yes, 39 weeks. Okay, 1 week, 39 weeks. Okay, 39 weeks, 1 week before EDD, 1 week before her expected date of delivery is the best time to do cesarean section because the risk to the baby is the least when you do it at 39 weeks. Before 39 weeks, you still have the risk of prematurity. And after 39 weeks, the risk of the baby dying in utero increases. So the best time to do a cesarean section at 39 weeks. So although this is the definition, if somebody asks you, what is the best time to do a cesarean section? Where the patient says, I just want a cesarean section. Your best time to do a cesarean section will be at 39 weeks. But anything after 28 weeks can be called a cesarean section. Okay, another second point in this definition is it is delivered through an incision on abdominal and uterine walls. Okay, if the uterus has ruptured and the baby is free floating in the peritoneal cavity and you do a surgery and you remove the baby, okay, and you do then suture of the uterus, it is not going to be called a cesarean section because you did not put an incision on the uterus and deliver the baby. What is this going to be called? Anybody? What is this surgery going to be called if you deliver a baby which has already the uterus has ruptured and the baby is in the peritoneal cavity? Do you know what this surgery is called? It's called laparotomy. Okay, It's called laparotomy for rupture of uterus and delivery of the baby. You just call it laparotomy. Any surgery where you open the abdominal cavity, Manish was close, he said peritotomy, we don't say peritotomy, we say laparotomy. Okay, so any surgery, if you're not sure what is the name of the surgery, you say laparotomy and proceed. Okay, if you don't know whether it is an ovarian tumor or a fibroid, but you're just going to open the abdominal cavity and see what is happening inside, and that surgery is called laparotomy. So the same way, if the uterus is ruptured and the baby is outside floating in the abdominal cavity, and then you deliver the baby like that, it is not going to be called cesarean section because you did not do a hysterotomy. You did not put an incision on the uterine wall. So that does not come under the definition of cesarean section. It's going to be laparotomy. Also, in cases of abdominal pregnancies, there are case reports of abdominal pregnancies and babies being alive. Okay, abdominal pregnancy is a type of ectopic pregnancy. Okay, the baby is not developing inside the uterine cavity. The placenta has got its attachment either from the intestines or from the liver. Somewhere the placenta has taken blood supply and the baby has grown. Okay, and you do a laparotomy and you deliver the baby. Okay, again, this is not going to be called a cesarean section because you did not put an incision on the uterine wall. So to remember this definition, you have to always keep two things in mind. It should be a viable baby, that is after the end of 28 week. It doesn't matter if the baby is alive or dead. Okay, delivering a dead baby also is called cesarean section, but it should have crossed the period of viability, that is the end of 28 weeks. And you should have put an incision on the abdominal and the uterine walls. So only if these criteria is satisfied, it will be called as a cesarean section. Next slide, please. Okay, cesarean section, there are, it's been done for almost 500, more than 500 years now. This is supposedly the birth of Julius Caesar, which is legendary. It did not really happen because till the 1800s, whenever they did a cesarean section, the mother never survived. And Julius Caesar's mother survived for a long time even after his birth. So this cannot be true. But that's how the name cesarean section. This is one of the reasons why the name cesarean section has come, because of the birth of Julius Caesar. Usually when a cesarean section was done by this method, the mother died. Okay, because there was no way they could stop the bleeding, or they didn't have antibiotics, there was no anesthesia. So this was considered a barbaric surgery by many. Okay, and also it was done perimortem. Okay. Next slide, please. So there are three origins of the word cesarean section. The first origin is from the name Lex Caesarea, which is a Roman law. So according to this law, that if a pregnant woman is dead or is dying, we are supposed to deliver the baby out, because it has to be taken for separate burial. You can't bury it when it is in utero. That's what they believe. Even in India, in some villages, when a pregnant woman is dead, they ask us, where can we deliver the baby and give it to them, because they want to give a separate burial for the baby. So according to this law, if a woman is dead, you can't bury her with the baby in utero. You need to deliver the baby out and take it for separate burial. So this Roman law was passed, and because of which they started doing a cesarean section in a dead woman or a dying woman who's going to die soon, so that they could bury the baby separately. Okay, for religious reasons. Other explanation is that it is derived from the Latin verb sedere, which means to cut, which is what is cesarean section, which is not, it is not born of the womb by vaginal route, it means to cut. And for a long time, the commonest reason they say because cesarean section is because of Julius Caesar, but that's not actually true, because we know his mother lived long time after his birth. So these are the three reasons for the origin of the word cesarean. Yeah, next slide. So history of cesarean. So till 1876, none of the mothers survived. Okay, they used to do a cesarean section. They did not know that they had to suture back the uterus, and it used to bleed continuously from the walls of the uterus, and the woman used to die of hemorrhage. Even if the bleeding was controlled, we did not have antibiotics, and the mother used to die. So there were a lot of obstetricians who actually opposed cesarean section, because they found it very barbaric, because the mothers used to die. It had almost 100% mortality rate for mothers, even if the baby survives. So now this obstetrician, particular obstetrician Porro, he did not think of suturing the uterus, but what he did a cesarean section, delivered the baby, and immediately he also did a hysterectomy and removed the uterus. So there was no more cause for bleeding. Okay, so that is how his cesarean section, the mother survived. So he followed up the cesarean with a subtotal hysterectomy. Subtotal means leaving behind the cervix. Okay, and that was sutured. So his patient survived. So that is how they thought that okay, if you remove the uterus after doing the cesarean section, it is somehow better outcome for the mother. It was Max Sanger who first sutured the uterine walls. He was the first person who thought that you should put a suture inside. Previously, they were very afraid to put a suture inside the abdominal cavity, thinking it's a foreign body and becomes a focus for infection. But he successfully sutured the uterine walls and his patients survived. Okay, so that's how the first idea came that after cesarean section, we should start suturing the uterine wall and that would give a better outcome. Now, in 1881, Currer, okay, so he did a transverse lower segment operation for the first time. So this transverse lower segment operation which he did, the present cesarean section, what we are doing, the transverse incision on the lower uterine segment, that was given by Currer. So that incision which we put in on the uterus, on the lower segment of the uterus is called Kerr's incision, K-E-H-R, named after Currer. The incision which we are putting for our lower segment cesarean section on the uterus is named after Currer because previously all were doing a classical cesarean. Now, Fan and Steele described the transverse suprapubic skin incision. The incision which was widely followed before was a vertical midline incision on the skin. Okay, because a vertical midline incision, you will be able to see easily the entire uterus and the abdominal cavity. It's easy to enter. So everybody was doing a vertical midline incision, but Fan and Steele was the first one to suggest that for a cesarean section, let's do a transverse incision, skin incision. Currer is talking about the uterine incision, which is transverse. Fan and Steele is talking about the skin incision, which is transverse. Now, what Munroker did, Munroker is a famous obstetrician, and what he did is combined the transverse skin incision with the lower segment transverse incision. So this is the lower segment cesarean section, which we are doing currently. It is combining the Fan and Steele incision with the Kerr's incision. So the Fan and Steele incision is a transverse incision on the skin. Kerr's incision is a transverse incision on the uterus. This is what is followed in modern day cesarean section. Okay, next slide. But following that, there was a rapid rise in cesarean section rate. Initially, everybody was scared to do a cesarean section because it had a high mortality rate for the mother. But with the advent of suturing and antibiotics and better anesthesia, the cesarean section rate started increasing. Now, this has happened because of medicalizing of pregnancy. Okay, pregnancy is a natural phenomenon, but it has got medicalized a lot. So instead of doing a clinical examination, we started doing more scans. In labor, we started using the cardiotopography. So we used to pick up variations in the heart rate. Okay, for breech delivery, because of the term breech trial, they said that a vaginal delivery is not safe. So cesarean section increased. Less and less people started using vacuum and forceps because they were scared of the injuries to the baby. And rising rates of induction of labor happened. And basically, the doctors were fearful of litigation. Cesarean section, there is no risk at all. You just do a cesarean section, you deliver a healthy baby to the parents. Whereas normal delivery is very unpredictable. Anything can happen, which you may not be able to predict, and then there would be a court case. So, because of fear of litigation, there is a current rise in the cesarean section rate. According to WHO, the cesarean section rate should be 15%. Okay, of 100, if there are 100 deliveries, only 15% should be cesarean section, whereas in India, it's about 30 to 40%, and in metropolitans, it's almost close to 50%. 50% of deliveries are done by cesarean section. Plus, there is a cesarean delivery on demand, which is increasing. Mothers are now demanding cesarean section. They are saying that we're just going to have one baby or two babies, and we don't want to take the risk and we don't want to go through the pain. So that is the reason for the rising cesarean section rate, which we are seeing nowadays. Next slide. So the indications for cesarean section are absolute indications and relative indication. Absolute means there is no chance for vaginal delivery. You have to do a cesarean section. Okay. Even if the baby is dead, it does not matter. It's not going to deliver vaginally. You have to do a cesarean section. Relative indication, vaginal delivery is possible, but it has some amount of risk to the mother or the baby. Okay, the mother can have a very bad perineal tear, or the baby might get asphyxiated, but still you can do a vaginal delivery, but it has some amount of risk to the mother and baby. So these are absolute and relative indications. Next slide. So the absolute indications are central placenta previa. Does anybody know what is central placenta previa? Does anybody know what is central placenta previa? Okay, contracted pelvis. Okay, where there is contracted pelvis is that size of the pelvis which a baby cannot deliver. Okay, a baby of any size cannot deliver normally in that sort of pelvis. Yeah, placenta at the os. Yeah, placenta completely occupies the internal os. The center of the placenta, when the center of the placenta is corresponding to the center of the internal os, that is called central placenta previa. Okay, in placenta previa, all kinds of placenta previa is dipping into the lower uterine segment. But when you say central placenta previa, the center of the placenta is connected to the center of the os. So it is occupying all over the os and the lower uterine segment. That is central placenta previa. If it is a lateral or marginal placenta previa with dilatation, the placenta does not come anywhere in the at the level of the cervix. But in central, even if it's dilates, your placenta is going to be obstructing the delivery of the baby. Okay, so you cannot do a normal delivery with central placenta previa. Patient is going to bleed to death. Okay, contracted pelvis means any size baby is not going to deliver in this pelvis. This pelvis is too small for any size of the baby. So that is contracted pelvis. So you have to do a cesarean section. A pelvic mass causing obstruction. So there is a mass in the pelvis. Either it can be a cervical fibroid, okay, or some other advanced carcinoma cervix, or some obstruction in the vagina, because of which you have to do a cesarean section. Vaginal delivery is not possible. So central placenta previa, contracted pelvis, and anything obstructing the birth canal. It can be at the level of the cervix or the vagina or anything in the pelvis. So these are absolute indications for cesarean section. Next slide. So the most commonly we are doing cesarean sections are for these relative indications. Cephalopelvic disproportion. Okay. So how is cephalopelvic disproportion different from contracted pelvis? Cephalopelvic disproportion is there is disparity between the size of the head and the pelvis. For this baby, this pelvis is not adequate. In her next pregnancy, if there is a smaller baby, then maybe this pelvis might be adequate. Okay, we do not know. So cephalopelvic disproportion means there is a disparity between this baby and this pelvis. It is not an absolute term, whereas contracted pelvis is an absolute term. It means this woman cannot deliver vaginally. That's what contracted pelvis means. It is a recurrent indication, whereas CPD means maybe next time if there is a smaller baby, it might deliver. Okay. Now, previous cesarean delivery is not actually an indication. You can try for a vaginal delivery, but it is also a relative indication. Where after explaining this to the mother, risk of scar rupture and all, if they opt for a cesarean section, then you have to offer a cesarean section to them. Or when you assess and you feel that you cannot offer a vaginal delivery, then you end up doing a repeat cesarean. Non-reassuring fetal heart rate, fetal distress. Okay, then so when there is fetal distress or dystocia. Dystocia is abnormal labor. There's a problem with the passenger. It can either be a breech or a big baby macrosomia passage or power, not good uterine contractions. Okay, so that shoulder dystocia, all that when it happens, you can do a cesarean section. Antepartum hemorrhage. So abruptio placenta or placenta previa, you have to do a cesarean section either to save the mother or both the mother and the baby. Even the baby gets stressed because less blood is going to the baby. Malpresentations, breech, shoulder, transverse lie, bro presentation. So in bro, as you know, there is no mechanism of labor. You have to do transverse lie, again, no mechanism of labor. You have to do cesarean section. Breech delivery is possible, but there has to be an experienced operator who can do a breech delivery. Plus, you need to explain the risk to the mother of the head, the delivery of the aftercoming head and aftercoming head getting stuck and all injuries, which is increased. You can do a vaginal delivery. That's why this is a relative indication. Failed surgical induction of labor. Okay, failure to progress in labor. So you have induced labor. She's either crossed her dates and you have induced labor, but she fails to go into labor. Bad obstetric history. She's had 3 abortions, 4 abortions, and this is a precious pregnancy. So that also becomes an indication for cesarean section. Severe preeclampsia and eclampsia, where you feel that she might not deliver in the next 6 to 8 hours, they end up in a cesarean section. Uncontrolled diabetes and heart disease, where she should not exert, she should not have labor pain or some mechanical obstructions. You can also offer a cesarean section. Next slide. So common indications in primea gravida are fetal distress, failed induction, cephalopelvic disproportion, dystocia, malposition. Whereas in multigravida, it is commonly because they had a previous cesarean or a placenta previa, which is more common in multi-parous women, and malpresentation. Because of the lax abdominal wall, they end up having a malpresentation. Next slide. So depending upon whether you have done a planned cesarean section or whether this was an emergency cesarean section, you can divide cesarean section into two types: elective cesarean and emergency cesarean. So elective cesarean is you have informed your anesthetist, your pediatrician, okay, and the patient also knows that this is going to be the time. There are some patients who come with a muhurta TV. They want their baby to be born on this day at this time. So you plan accordingly and you do a cesarean section. That is called elective. Emergency is it is done due to an acute obstructive emergency. That a time interval of 30 minutes has to be taken. There is something called decision to delivery interval. Okay, if you decide to do a cesarean section within 30 minutes, the baby has to be out. So that is the kind of emergency that you call it as an emergency cesarean section. So when some event has occurred, which has forced you to do a cesarean section immediately, we call it an emergency. Or another way of telling elective and emergency is when the patient is not in labor and you have taken up a cesarean section, it is an elective. And when the patient is in labor and you have done a cesarean section, it is emergency. Okay, that's another way of differentiating elective and emergency. Okay, next slide. Elective cesarean section benefits are the patient has not gone into labor. So when a patient goes into labor, then because of the contraction, the baby might be asphyxiated. So all that risk factors are removed, and there is no pelvic floor dysfunction. Even after patient has gone into labor and she's 6-7 centimeters dilated, and then you do a cesarean section, there is still a risk of pelvic floor dysfunction. She has a risk of going in for prolapse. Cesarean section, after the woman has gone into active labor, also if you take off a cesarean section, there can be pelvic floor dysfunction. But elective cesarean, the patient has never gone into labor, so there is no risk of pelvic floor dysfunction. That's the advantage. Okay. But the risk with cesarean is placenta previa is more common, and hysterectomy also there is, because if she has gone into labor, oxytocin hormone would have released and it contracts the uterus. That is not there, and risk of going in for PPH is more. So that is why it might end up in hysterectomy. So all those risks are higher in elective cesarean. And as I told you, the timing of elective cesarean, if anybody asks you, is at 39 weeks. That is 1 week prior to the expected EDD. Okay, because at that time there is a lowest risk of TTTN. What is TTN? Does anybody know what is TTN? Okay, so at 39 weeks, we do a cesarean section. And if the maturity is uncertain, you don't know if the baby is really 39 weeks, because some women don't know their LMP. Then you take your first trimester scan and you calculate the EDD and do it at 39 weeks. Okay, or we don't usually do this. We do an amniocentesis for lecithin sphingomyelin ratio to see if the baby's lungs are mature, and then you plan your elective cesarean, or you wait for spontaneous onset of labor, and as soon as she sets into labor, you do cesarean section. Okay, this is done if you don't really know her dates, but if her dates are known and she has good dates and her first trimester scan also is corresponding to her LMP dates, then you are supposed to do a elective cesarean section at 39 weeks. TTN is transient tachypnea of newborn. Okay, so anytime before 39 weeks, if you do a cesarean section, the baby has a chance of getting admitted in the NICU with transient tachypnea. It has some breathing difficulty, okay, because of which it may need NICU admission. So to prevent this transient tachypnea of newborn, we do it at 39 weeks. Next slide. Okay, this NICE is given by UK guidelines. It's a category of emergency LSES. So category 1 is the real emergency LSES, when there is immediate threat to the life of the woman or the fetus, and within 30 minutes of your decision, you're supposed to deliver the baby. So this is like a real emergency cesarean, which is category 1. It usually you do it when there is abruption, massive abruption, and patient is bleeding or uterus has ruptured. Okay, so when you detect such things and within 30 minutes or cord prolapse, all that when it happens, you need to immediately do a delivery. That is actually category 1 cesarean section, emergency. Category 2 is urgent, where there is an indication, but you can take some time and prepare the woman before doing. Like sleep previous LSES woman has gone into labor, high risk of scar rupture, so you need to do it urgently, but it is not an emergency. There is not immediately life-threatening risk. Meconium stain like fetal distress, where you can buy some time. Okay, so this comes under urgent category. Okay, where you don't really have to shout and scream at everybody and push the woman into OT. you can take a little more time. So within 75 minutes, you can do a cesarean section. Category 3 is there is no maternal or fetal compromise. At this point of time, mother is doing well and the baby is doing well, but you can't let it go further and you need early delivery. So this is usually done in IUGR and pre-eclampsia. Category 4 is elective, where you sit and talk with the family members and you find out when your OT is free and you plan what is the time for a cesarean section. So these are the 4 categories depending upon the level of urgency or emergency that you divide your cesarean section categories. Next slide. So now you can divide cesarean section based on uterine incision. Okay. Lower segment cesarean section is extraction through an incision made in the lower segment. Okay. And as I told you, the Kerr's incision is what we are following, the transverse incision through transperitoneal approach. This is the only method we are practicing nowadays. Hardly anybody, I have at least in my tenure, not seen a classical cesarean section being performed. I've only seen a lower segment cesarean section being performed. So hardly anybody does a classical. So what is a classical? It is done through where the baby is extracted through an incision in the upper segment of the uterus. Okay, very, very limited indications in present day scenario. Next slide. Okay. So this picture is a misnomer. Okay. So in the classical, the first picture is classical cesarean and the second picture is lower segment. Now what I'm telling is the first picture can also be a lower segment cesarean section. Can somebody tell me why? The first picture where it is written classical, it also can be a lower segment cesarean section. Yeah. So I have seen a lot of cases where the skin incision is vertical. The older obstetricians, they always prefer a vertical skin incision. So we don't know what is the incision on the uterus. So the upper picture also can be a lower segment cesarean section. So lower segment cesarean section need not be always a transverse skin incision. With a vertical midline incision on the skin also, you can do a lower segment cesarean section. So just by looking at the scar on the skin, you cannot term it as a classical or lower segment. If you look at this picture, what you can say is this is a midline vertical skin incision. This is a fan and steel skin incision. That's what you can comment based on this picture. But to actually comment what is the type of cesarean done, you should go through the notes and see what was the incision put on the uterus. Okay. If they have done on an upper segment vertical incision, that is going to be a classical. And if they have done transverse incision, if they have done transverse on skin and inside they have done vertical, it's going to become a classical. So what is going to matter here is only your uterine incision. It does not matter what is the incision on the skin. The incision on the uterus, if it is midline, if it's upper segment vertical, it's classical, and if it is transverse, it is lower segment cesarean section. So don't get confused by the incision on the skin. Next slide. Indications for classical cesarean section. When lower segment approach is difficult. Okay, you wanted to do a lower segment, but when you open up, you see there are dense adhesions due to previous cesarean and you can't access the lower segment. And once anesthesia is given, you need to deliver the baby really early. So you have no real option other than to go through the upper uterine segment. Severely contracted pelvis, such a small pelvis that you can't even put in your retractor and visualize the lower segment. Okay, so then they do a classical cesarean. Or if you go through the lower segment, there might be a chance of heavy bleeding, like a big fibroid on the lower segment, or a CA cervix, which is very vascular, or they have repaired a VVF. What is a VVF? Anybody? Or a complete anterior placenta previa, where you put an incision, you are going to go through the placenta. So lower segment approach is risky. So because of which you have to do a classical cesarean section. Vesicovaginal fistula, correct. So if a previous vesicovaginal fistula has been repaired and you again do a lower segment cesarean section, that repair gets, again you would have to do a repeat surgery for VVF. So that's why they prefer to do a classical. Perimortem cesarean section. Perimortem cesarean section is an extreme emergency procedure where a woman is dead or you know that she's going to die and you do an emergency cesarean section. And it is believed that a classical cesarean section is much faster to do than a lower segment cesarean section. So that's why they used to, if it's a woman is dying and you want to do a perimortem, they would prefer to do a classical cesarean section. But now I think none of the obstetricians now are trained in classical cesarean. So a lower segment is obviously going to be faster, but that's why this indication has been given, because you don't have to separate the bladder and push it down. That's why they believe that a classical is faster. So within 10 minutes of maternal death, if you have to deliver the baby, then they go for a classical cesarean section. Next slide. So what are the steps of lower segment cesarean section? So we have preoperative preparation, then comes your incision on the skin and the uterus, delivery of the baby, the head and the trunk, suturing back all the layers which you have opened, and the concluding part. Yeah, next slide. So preoperative, first thing which is important is consent, consent, and consent. Okay, so your consent has to be in the language of the patient. Okay, so you speak to her in a language which is comfortable to her, and also written permission. So you not only for the procedure, anesthesia, anything, anesthesia complication, blood transfusion, it's like a blanket consent for anything that can go wrong during the surgery. Okay, so whenever you are writing a consent, there are three things which are important. You say that consent has been taken in the patient's language. You have explained the procedure. You have explained the risks associated with the procedure. You have explained what are the alternatives to the procedure, like vaginal delivery can be done, and what are the risks associated with that, and all that option has been given. And if anything untoward happens, we will not hold the hospital or staff responsible in case of untoward, which you can't predict those complications. So your consent form should have all these features when you're doing a cesarean section, and it should be signed by the patient and the attender. Okay, so a consent form has to be given, and usually we give them a soap or a non-organic iodide solution. They take bath with that because that clears all the microbes on the abdominal area. Same thing like a vaginal delivery, we do not shave back because that increases the risk of infections. So hair should be clipped. And sedative. All surgeries, major surgeries, the night before they give sedative so that the patient sleeps well the night before surgery. This should not be given in a cesarean section because a sedative can depress the baby. It can cause respiratory depression of the baby. So cesarean section is one surgery where you do not give the sedative at night. All of the surgeries, like if you're doing a hysterectomy or any other general surgery procedures, we usually give a sedative. That has to be skipped in a cesarean section. Yeah, next slide. Okay, a cesarean section is high risk for aspiration. Okay, the gastric contents, because there is very less space in the abdomen because of the uterus filling the abdomen, they can aspirate the gastric contents into the respiratory tract, because of which you have to neutralize the gastric contents. So they give a non-particulate antacid, and antacid is given orally to the mother. And there are 3 injections which we give the mother before cesarean section, which is an antibiotic, an antiemetic, okay, and ranitidine or pantoprazole, okay, to decrease the acidity in the stomach. So these are 3 injections which we give. So what is the antibiotic which is commonly given for cesarean section before we do a cesarean section? So metoclopramide is the antiemetic. It increases the tone of the esophageal sphincter to reduce the stomach contents. Yeah, cephalosporins. Yeah, we give any kind of cephalosporin. It can be cefazolin or cefotaxime. Okay, so zone, all that is a cephalosporin is given just before 1 hour before skin incision or just before skin incision. So ranitidine and antiemetic metoclopramide. And she has to be preferably fasting. Overnight fasting is better because she's at high risk for aspiration compared to a non-pregnant patient. So she stomach should be empty. So that is one more advantage of doing an elective cesarean section. Okay, you can tell her just don't eat in the morning, and in the morning you can prepare for your cesarean section. In emergency, we might need to do a cesarean section with the patient on full stomach. Again, increased risk to the patient because high chance of aspiration. Okay, next slide. So you keep an indwelling Foley's catheter because the bladder is a neighbor to the uterus. And if the bladder is not empty, then it is very difficult for you to do your lower segment cesarean section. Okay, that is one reason. Another one is she can't get up and void her urine immediately after cesarean section. So she would need the Foley's catheter for some time. So you put up indwelling Foley's. FHS should be checked once more at this stage. Usually after, in cases of fetal distress, we have seen that whether FHS is dropping, and you take about 30 minutes to shift the patient into the OT. And sometimes if we do not check the FHS on the OT, we have delivered a dead baby sometimes, because by the time we have shifted from the labor room to the OT, the baby died. Okay, so we are doing the cesarean section to save the baby, and once the baby is dead, there is no need for that cesarean section. So indication is gone. So always before doing, if you're doing a cesarean section for fetal distress, when the patient is shifted into the OT on the OT table, make it a point to check the fetal heart rate before anesthesia is given. Okay. Neonatologist, a pediatrician should be available, okay, to resuscitate the baby if required. Cross-match blood, any major surgical procedure, we keep cross-match blood. IV cannula fluids, okay, spinal anesthesia causes hypotension. So the patient has to be given like a bolus of about 1 liter of fluid before we prep her and take her into the OT. So then IV cannula plus to give all your antibiotics and the antiemetics, there has to be an IV cannula. So this is the pre-operative preparation of a patient before you shift her in for a cesarean section. Next slide. So the anesthesia can be spinal, epidural, or general. Okay. What is the commonest anesthesia we are using for cesarean section? Is it spinal, epidural? Oh yeah, it is spinal anesthesia. Okay. So as all of you have seen, it is a spinal anesthesia which is given for cesarean section, which is adequate. It gives coverage. Patient is aware and she's awake and she can hear her baby crying. So always a spinal anesthesia is preferred. General anesthesia is done when you need to do a cesarean very fast. So as the patient anesthetist is giving anesthesia, you can start painting and draping and do a cesarean. Or the patient's BP is very low and the patient is in shock. At that time, we cannot give a spinal anesthesia, then we go for a general anesthesia. So that is the only indication for general. Epidural also we can give. Epidural takes much longer to give than a spinal. So basically the anesthesia which we prefer is spinal. Okay. So after the spinal is given, you put the patient in dorsal position and 50-degree tilt to prevent supine hypotension and start painting and draping. Okay. So then comes your incision. There are many types of incision. There is vertical, transverse skin incision or fan and steel incision as I showed you. And packing, the Doyne's retractor is introduced. Next slide. Okay. So this is a cesarean section set. Charut, I don't have the arrow. Can you point at the Doyne's retractor? Okay. Yeah, so that is a Doyne's retractor. So this is an instrument which is specific for a cesarean section. This is used to retract the bladder. All other instruments we use also in other surgeries. But the instrument specific for cesarean section is a Doyne's retractor to protect the bladder. Other than this, we have Allis forceps and artery forceps and curved scissors and scalpels, okay? Sponge holding forceps, tooth forceps, Babcock's forceps to hold the tubes. So all these instruments can be used in a lot of surgeries, but the instrument specific for cesarean section is the Doyne's retractor to retract the bladder. Next slide, please. Okay, so the abdominal incision is fan and steel incision can be used, which is a transverse curvilinear incision just above the pubic hairline. Okay, it's also called smiling incision because it's a curving incision with a curve upwards. It's also called bikini line incision because it will not be seen if a woman wears a bikini. Okay, it's a cosmetic incision so that the scar will not be seen. Okay, for cosmetic purposes, the fan and steel incision was introduced. Now, Joyle-Cohen incision is a transverse. It's like a straight incision. It's not like a curving incision. It's a transverse incision. It's slightly higher than the fan and steel. It's about 3 centimeters below the line joining the anterior superior iliac spine. Okay, so the difference between Joyle-Cohen and fan and steel is Joyle-Cohen is at a higher level and it's transverse. It's not curved. Okay, Maillard incision is again a transverse incision. Here, usually we followed this Maillard incision when we are doing surgeries like hysterectomy or you need more access in the pelvis. Okay, so you also cut the rectus muscles. In Joyle-Cohen and fan and steel, we're just separating the rectus abdominis. We don't cut it. So in the Maillard incision, we're also cutting the rectus muscle. Next slide, please. Okay, so the midline vertical was what was being followed, and it's actually a very easy incision to do. And this is the fastest access and least vascular access to enter. But there are some lines on the skin which you should follow. Anybody knows what those lines are? Surgical anatomy. So your incision, if it is along those lines, there is less tension on scar healing. And your incision, yeah, Langer's line. So all your fan and steel, Maillard and Joyle-Cohen will be around your Langer's lines. So there is less stretch on the scar and the scar heals beautifully. Whereas your midline vertical is cutting through the Langer's line. So there is a lot of tension and stretch in your scar. You get like a really bad scar. That's why we don't do a midline vertical anymore. So the commonest incision we are following is the fan and steel. Okay, which can be about 3 centimeters above the pubic symphysis. or a modified span and steel, which is along that crease, which is there, the pubic crease. Okay, next slide. So abdominal entry, we have skin. After skin, we get the fascia. Which are the two parts of the fascia below the skin? Do you know the names? After the fascia, we see the fascia is nothing but this fat and fatty layer. Below the fascia, Scarpa's fascia, yes. Any other? One more fascia? Yeah, Campus. So below skin, we have the Campus fascia and the Scarpa's fascia. We cut through that. Then you will reach that white glistening layer, which is the rectus sheath, which also you open transversely. And underneath the rectus sheath, you see the two longitudinally running muscle fibers, the rectus abdominis, which you do not cut. You just separate the two rectus abdominis, and then you enter you see the parietal peritoneum. Once you open the peritoneum, you're in the cavity, peritoneal cavity. So this is abdominal entry, skin, fascia, rectus sheath. Okay. So the first picture is showing you the skin incision. As you can see, it's the transverse curvilinear Phanon steel incision. And you can see the yellowish structure, which is the fat. Okay. And the rectus sheath, they are cutting the rectus sheath in the below picture. And you can see the red structure, the rectus muscle in the midline. Now the last picture which you see, they are held with the alleys, the rectus sheath. Can you see the whitish rectus sheath? So that is the rectus sheath which they hold, and below that is the two rectus muscle which they have separated in the midline. Okay. So in between the rectus muscle, again, that yellowish part which you see is the parietal peritoneum. So these are, in the last picture, you will be able to see all the layers: the skin, the subcutaneous fascia, the rectus sheath which is held by alleys. Underneath that, the two bellies of the rectus abdominis running vertically. In between the two bellies, the yellowish layer is your parietal peritoneum, which you need to open to enter into the peritoneal cavity. Next slide. So once you enter into the peritoneal cavity, you correct any dextro rotation. Uterus is always rotated to the right side, and so your assistant has to get it and make it longitudinal. If you do not correct dextro rotation and you put an incision, you run the risk of going into the broad ligament, and there in the broad ligament, your uterine arteries are running and it can cause hemorrhage. Okay, so you have to always remember to correct dextro rotation before you put a uterine incision. To put your Doyens retractor in as soon as you open the peritoneum to protect the bladder, and you open the loose peritoneum which is present between the bladder and the uterus. What is the name of this peritoneum which is present between the bladder and the uterus? So you have to cut open. So there are two peritoneums here. We have a parietal peritoneum and the visceral peritoneum. The parietal peritoneum is the peritoneum which you are opening to enter into the peritoneal cavity. Okay, so that you have opened and you have gone in, you can see the uterus. Now you have to open the peritoneum which is present between from the uterus, it is going on to the bladder. This is a visceral peritoneum. Anybody, what is the name of this peritoneum? Yeah, not the pouch of Douglas. The pouch of Douglas is between the uterus and the rectum. Between the uterus and the bladder, somebody said it is the UV fold. What is UV fold? It's the fold between two organs. Utrovesical. Okay. So you have to open the visceral peritoneum here, which is the utrovesical fold of peritoneum. Next slide. Yeah, utrovesical. So the peritoneum is identified and it is entered, and you can see the uterus. On the picture below, you can see them holding the utrovesical fold of peritoneum and cutting it. And then an incision is made on the uterus, slightly below where you have cut the UV fold of peritoneum. Your Doyens retractor, you can see, once the peritoneal cavity is entered and you can see the uterus, immediately your Doyens comes in to protect the bladder so that you don't injure the bladder. And here, in the last one, they have made an incision on the uterus, and they are extending the incision using their fingers. Okay. So this incision which they have made on the uterus is called Kerr's incision. What you can see glistening in the uterus is the bag of membranes, okay, which they have not yet ruptured. So the bag of membranes is intact. They have just made a small nick on the uterus, and you can see the bag of membranes protruding through that. Next slide. Okay. So this is again the UV fold opening. Next is they have made a nick on that. So either with your fingers you can extend the incision, or some people are more comfortable putting your scissors and then extending the incision. So you make a small nick using the knife. Okay, that's what you've seen in picture 2. That small nick is made in the knife, and what we usually do is we put our fingers in and pull it upwards. Now again, your incision on the uterus is a curvilinear incision with a curve upwards. So this is to protect the uterine vessel. If you make a straight incision, it goes directly to the uterine arteries and you can injure the arteries. So again, this is a smiling incision which goes with the curve upwards. So you can do it either with your fingers, or in the last picture which you can see, they are using the scissors and extending the incision. Next slide. So this curved incision is made at a level. So where you have opened the UV fold of peritoneum, slightly below that, you put an incision on the uterus till you see the membranes. Okay. Then you put two index fingers and the muscles are split transversely upwards. Okay. So you are facing the patient's feet. And this is a movement which you do where you extend the incision and you pull it upwards so that it becomes like a smiling curvilinear incision. This method minimizes the blood loss. Okay. Because you're stretching, when you stretch the muscle, there is less chance of cutting the muscle fibers. If you use a scissor, you're actually cutting blood vessels. So because of which the bleeding is more. So when you stretch it with your fingers, the chance of bleeding is less. Next slide. So this is not the only incision. The curves incision is not the only incision. There is a lower vertical incision, where instead of putting a transverse incision, you put a lower vertical incision. This is called Kronig's. This method was suggested by Kronig's. But if it extends downwards, your bladder gets involved, so it's not followed anymore. But why they wanted to do Kronig's is, if you don't have enough space, you can go on extending it upwards. So more space for you to deliver the baby with a Kronig's incision. Now the classical incision is upper segment. As a rule, classical cesarean section, it's not on the lower segment. You put an incision on the upper segment. Now J incision is, you have put a curves incision and you feel that there is not enough space to deliver the baby. One angle of the incision, you curve it up and make it vertical. So that is J. Inverted T is, from the midpoint of your transverse incision, you put a vertical incision, that is inverted T. This is all done where you have difficulty in delivering the baby and you need more space. Okay, so you make your transverse incision either a J from one angle or from the midline and inverted T. Okay, a vertical uterine section incision is made and the lower segment is poorly developed. Yeah, next slide. Okay, so the picture A, which you can see, is your curves incision. It is just a transverse curvilinear incision. Picture B, you didn't have enough space because of a transverse incision, you couldn't deliver the baby's head. So one angle, they extended it upwards. That is your J incision. Now C incision is, there is a transverse incision and from its midline, you go vertically up. Inverted T, this is the inverted T incision. So more space for you to deliver the baby. And D picture is what we are not using anymore, which is a classical incision. Okay, upper segment. All the other incisions are lower segment with little bit extension to the upper segment. Whereas D is purely upper segment incision. You're putting a midline vertical upper segment, which is classical cesarean section. Yeah, next slide. So after you go into the incision, you rupture the membrane, suck out all the amniotic fluid and put your hand in. And once your hand is wedged in and you get the head up to the level of the incision, then you remove your Doyne's retractor. And here again, flexion, flexion, flexion. Everywhere flexion is important. If you're delivering the baby vaginally also, flex it. Maximum flexion will give you the smallest diameter. If you're doing vacuum delivery, forceps delivery, you have to put it at the flexion point so that the smallest diameter comes out through this. Even in a cesarean section, you don't want to unnecessarily increase the size of the uterine incision. So you flex the head. Okay, you try to flex the head and make the chin touch the neck so that the smallest diameter of the head comes out through the incision. So once you elevate the head and bring it to the level of the incision, then you ask your anesthetist or your assistant to give fundal pressure and then you deliver the baby's head. Next slide. And as soon as the head is delivered and before you deliver the body, you take your mucus sucker and suck out mucus from the mouth first and then the nostrils. Okay. Then you deliver the shoulders. And after delivery of shoulders, AMTSL has to be followed. Oxytocin has to be given or methergine to help in contraction. Rest of the body is delivered slowly. And then is your clamping and cutting of the cord. Okay. And the baby is handed over to the pediatrician, deliver the placenta. So the optimal interval between uterine incision and delivery should be less than 90 seconds. If you take more than 1.5 minutes after you put a uterine, once you put a uterine incision, the vessels in the uterus go into contraction and less blood is going to the baby. So within 1.5 minutes of doing an incision in the uterus, you should deliver the baby. Otherwise, it goes into asphyxia. Its ABGAS scores get very low. So that's why there is a lot of stress in obstetricians that when they can't deliver a baby and they end up doing an inverted T. So this is where your vacuum helps, where you can put a vacuum and pull out the baby. Or if it's deeply wedged and very deep and your fingers can't reach the baby's head, You put a forceps and you deliver out the baby. If you use a single forceps to deliver the baby, what is that technique called as? What we did in last class. So you don't use both blades of the forceps. You just put one single blade and deliver the baby's head out. Next slide, please. Okay, so after the baby is out, you remove the placenta and membranes. As in vaginal delivery, you have to follow the technique of controlled cord traction. If your right hand is pulling on the cord, the left hand is on the uterus and preventing it from inversion. Even if you do not give support to with the left hand, even during cesarean section, there can be inversion of uterus, and the uterus might get inverted. Okay, which should not happen. So it has to be delivered by controlled cord traction, and all membranes should be removed. So with the dry gauze, you have to remove all the membranes, because if they are retained, then it can cause PPH. So you can explore the uterine cavity and see if you have left any membranes behind. Next slide. Okay, so the uterine cavity was opened, the first figure, and the head is hooking of the head by the fingers. You put your hand in and hook the head, and the head is delivered. So they are suctioning the baby's head and mouth, and the trunk is delivered. So in the picture where the placenta is being delivered, can you see the left hand is on the fundus of the uterus, and it's holding and giving, that other hand is acting as the control, so that the uterus does not invert. Okay. So once everything is out, they have held the edges of the uterus with Ali's clamp, and it's ready for suturing. Next slide. So many examiners ask you, what is the suture material used? We use a delayed absorbable suture material, which is polygalactin, otherwise called Vicryl. And the suturing of the wound is done. Some people prefer to keep it inside the abdomen. Some people get the uterus out of the abdomen, so it's visible and it's easier to suture. Okay. So the margins of the wound are picked up by Ali's forceps or green armitage. These are the two instruments which are used to hold the edges of the uterus, one for each angle, and one for the upper margin and one for the lower margin. And the uterine incision is sutured in 2 layers. Next slide, please. Okay. So the uterine wound, you can see this, it is being sutured in 2 layers. And after the suturing is done, you check that it's not bleeding anywhere, put the uterus back and close all the layers the way you have opened it. In the last skin incision, as you can see, it is mattress suture. Usually what we follow is subcuticular, which is an absorbable suture, which is more cosmetic, and it need not be removed, but this mattress sutures have to be removed after the 7th or 8th day. You need to cut these sutures if you have used mattress sutures. Yes, next slide. So closed in layers. So before closure, always you have to confirm that mop and instrument count. If you leave a mop inside the peritoneal cavity, it becomes medico-legal. You can be held accountable in the court of law. So confirm with your nurse that the mops are all out. Instrument count, there's no instrument you have left inside the cavity. Now the layer which we've opened, which we will not close, is parietal peritoneum. Okay, peritoneum closes on its own. You don't need to suture it back. Rectus muscle, you can just approximate it in the midline using sutures, and rectus sheath is the most important layer which you have to close. Okay. Now, if rectus sheath is not closed well, it can cause wound dehiscence and or burst abdomen, and all the intestines can come out, and it becomes an emergency, one of the complications if you have not closed rectus sheath. So you can use either Vicryl delayed absorbable, or some people also prefer to use non-absorbable suture material, which is Prolene, polypropylene, to close the rectus sheath, because it's the most important layer to be closed in the abdomen. Any surgery, the rectus sheath, okay, that is like your anchoring. If that is not closed, then it can lead to burst abdomen. Skin can be closed with mattress or subcuticular sutures or clip. And the subcutaneous fascia, if it is more than 2 centimeters, it needs to be closed. If it's less than 2 centimeters, then you can leave the subcutaneous layer. You can go from directly from rectus sheath to skin. Next slide. So a concluding part is, after everything is done, you check again that mops, everything, the numbers count is proper. You peritoneal suture is used. If non-absorbable suture is used, it remains on the sheath. The next time when you're doing the cesarean section, you will find that non-absorbable suture, and you cut through the suture when you're doing your second cesarean. Okay, it does not act as a foreign body and does not cause infection. And after being satisfied, uterus is contracted and abdomen is closed in layer. The last thing which you do is vaginal toileting to remove all the clots in the vagina. Yeah, next slide. Post-operative care. Next slide, please. So the first 4 hours actually is very important. Every hour you're supposed to observe for whether the uterus is well contracted, is there any bleeding in the vagina, is she passing clots, and what are the vitals, is there tachycardia, hypotension. So first 4 hours, almost every hour you're supposed to see the patient, following which it can be every 4th hourly in the first 24 hours that you look for vitals, and every time you see, you should check for vitals, urine output, contraction of the uterus, and vaginal bleeding. Okay, so this is what important from the patient point of view. Fluids, we give about 2.5 liters, about 5 fluids, which we give. Blood transfusion if she's lost a lot of blood and she had PPH. Oxytocin, we give usually after delivery. In the drip, we add about 5 to 10 units, which continues so that she doesn't have PPH in the post-op. So this is on day 0, on the day in the first 24 hours following surgery. Next slide. And antibiotics, so cephalosporins, and for anaerobic organisms, metronidazole is given IV 2 to 4 doses for 2 days. The analgesic of choice nowadays is paracetamol, because diclofenac can cause renal failure, and tramadol, all these NSAIDs have a risk. So comparatively, paracetamol, and they also have superior analgesic effect. So 1 gram IV is a drug of choice. And in the first 24 hours, she's encouraged to move her legs, flex and extend her legs, and flex and extend dorsiflexion of her ankles, and to breathe deeply. So this is because to prevent DVT and pulmonary embolism. Okay. And after 12 hours, she can even sit on the bed and get out of the bed if she doesn't want a catheter to evacuate the bladder. And breastfeed as early as possible, and at least every 2 hours following cesarean section, so that she can have adequate breast milk secretion and for the bonding between the mother and the baby. Next slide. So after 6 to 8 hours, you check for bowel sounds, and if bowel sounds are present, then you ask her to take clear fluids, water. Okay, and following which, if there is no vomiting and there is no distension of abdomen, and you can start her on soft diet. Next slide. On day 2, light solid diet of the patient's choice. So we ask them to take idli or upma or anything, a light solid diet. And if the patient is uncomfortable, you can give 3 to 4 teaspoons of lactulose to prevent constipation. So lots of fluids, okay, and to avoid spicy food and oily food, because of prolonged fasting, there might be chance of gastritis. So avoid gastritis inducing foods, no alcohol, nicotine, or any spicy or oily food. So everything else is okay in moderation. Lots of fluid. And day 5 or 6 before discharge, the abdominal skin stitches are to be removed. Otherwise, we do not usually put non-absorbable, we put an absorbable suture. So it just gets absorbed. We don't have to remove any stitches. Next slide. Patient is discharged on the day following removal if otherwise fit. And nowadays, patients want to go early. As early as 72 hours after surgery, we are sending patients. 24 hours after surgery, we remove the catheter. And after 72 hours, if the patient has flasked stools, we discharge the patient and ask her to come back on the 7th day just for a checkup. Next slide. Now the classical cesarean section which we're doing, here the difference is the abdominal incision is vertical midline, in which 1/3 of the incision is extending above the umbilicus also. And again, the incision of the uterus again is vertical midline, and it is a very thick upper segment. So you have to go really deep to reach the membranes. And placenta is always in the upper segment of the uterus. So you might reach the placenta when you do a classical cesarean. So you have to go between the placenta and the uterus and deliver. Now the baby, usually the head of the baby is in the lower segment. So what you will find first is the legs of the baby. So in classical cesarean section, you're delivering the baby as breech. So that is the difference between the technique in lower segment and classical. Vertical skin incision, vertical uterine incision, and you will find the placenta before the baby because placenta is upper segment, and your delivery of baby is as breech. It is not as cephalic. Okay, and there is a thicker layer, so you have to close in 3 layers when you suture a classical scar. Next slide. So technically classical is easy, but since we don't know, we have not seen, we find the lower segment section to be easier. Blood loss is more in classical because the upper segment, it bleeds more because it's a thicker segment. Blood loss is lesser in lower segment and the wall is thin, and the perfect peritonization is possible. And if there is placenta previa or transverse lie, it is easier to do a classical cesarean section. Post-operative chance of infection and poor suturing, because it's very difficult to approximate the thick layers, is all more with classical cesarean section. And the scar healing is always better in lower segment because thin margins and there's perfectly you can suture. Muscle acquisition is perfect, less wound hematoma because it's less vascular. And during healing, the lower segment, as I told you, is a passive segment. It does not contract and retract. It is only the upper segment which contracts and retracts. So there's a lot of tension on the scar in the classical cesarean section. Chance of gutter formation is unlikely in lower segment cesarean section because it's a thin lower segment. Okay, whereas in classical, chance of gutter formation is more. So scar rupture, obviously, as you know, classical cesarean section, there's more risk of patient having a scar rupture if she gets pregnant in the next pregnancy. Next slide. So the complications in any surgery, you have to say, any surgery which they ask you start with saying anesthetic, intraoperative and post-operative complications. Because we are dealing with obstetrics, there will be maternal and fetal complications. Both you have to tell when you're talking about complications of any obstetric surgery. Next slide. So anesthetic complications are Mendelssohn syndrome, where there is aspiration pneumonia because of aspiration of the gastric contents into the respiratory tract. Intraoperative, when you're doing a surgery, if your incision is extended to the side, you can involve the uterine vessels and there can be injury to the vessels and there will be broad ligament hematoma. The broad ligament gets filled with blood and sometimes it gets difficult to control. Uterine laceration at the lower uterine, your incision might go into the lower segment and might extend to the bladder and bladder might get injured. If it extends laterally, you have the ureters, okay? So ureters might get injured. And if you're not careful while suturing, you can accidentally take up a piece of the bubble when you're suturing near the angles, okay? Because posterior to the uterus is the bubble. Hemorrhage, it can be atonic PPH or traumatic PPH, or you can encounter a placenta which you cannot separate. So then it bleeds if you try to separate. So adherent placenta you can encounter when you're doing the cesarean section. Next slide. So immediate maternal complications are patient can go into PPH after surgery, or she can go into shock. Anesthesia, she might not respond to anesthesia well. Infection. So anybody asks you in any surgery for operative complications, it would be easy to say hemorrhage, injury, infection. Okay. So these three complications are common for all surgeries. Hemorrhage. So here the hemorrhage is postpartum hemorrhage or traumatic hemorrhage when you involve the uterine vessels. Okay. Infection is common. There can be infection, peritonitis can be there, or skin infection can be there. Injury is to our neighbors. In the front, we have bladder, in the laterally, we have ureters, and posteriorly, we have bowel. So all these injuries can be there. Other than that, can be DVT, deep vein thrombosis, for which the patient has to ambulate. Secondary PPH develops after about 2 weeks of a cesarean section. That's commonly because of infection. Intestinal obstruction, paralytic ileus can be seen because of blood in the peritoneal cavity, or there is a damage to the intestine. So the wound complications are, patient can come back to you with frank pus from the wound because of poor wound healing, or hematoma in the subcutaneous layer. You have not tackled all the bleeders and blood collects under the skin incision. Hematoma. Dehiscence. Now scar dehiscence is a term where the rectus sheath, rectus muscle, everything has been compromised and only the peritoneum is intact. Okay. And the uterus also, the scar is open. Burst abdomen is everything is open and only the skin is intact. If you open the skin, you might be able to see the intestine coming out of the abdomen. Okay, even the peritoneal coat is not intact. So these two are, burst abdomen is actually fatal. So that can happen if you have not sutured the rectus sheath properly. Rarely, necrotizing fasciitis can be also a rare complication of wound, of the skin wound. Remote complications are gynecological following cesarean section. They can have menstrual abnormalities or chronic pelvic pain. Incisional hernia. Some people are more prone, obese patients when you do a surgery. Intestinal obstruction due to adhesions. Any patient with a surgery can end up with adhesions. And future pregnancy, there has a risk of scar rupture. Okay. So these are the remote complications which can happen later. This rarely happens. This is a very scary picture where while putting an incision on the uterus, they have taken an incision on the baby's head. This usually this doesn't happen because we see the hair of the baby and that color is different. But sometimes it happens in breech presentation where the buttocks of the breech just look like the color of the uterine musculature, and you might end up putting like a laceration on the baby's buttocks. Okay, so that can happen because of your incision. RDS, I told you TTTN can happen. Now, cesarean hysterectomy is an operation where cesarean section is followed by removal of the uterus. After cesarean section, you're removing the uterus. So this can be done when there is adherent placenta. So when the placenta is adherent and if you try to remove the placenta, patient has heavy bleeding. So that is why you don't want to remove the placenta. You just end up removing the uterus. And you have tried everything possible. You have tried Wheeling suture, you have tried all your drugs and internal cutting ligation, and the patient BPH is not controlling. Then you end up with hysterectomy. Big fibroid, and the patient wants her fibroid uterus to be removed after cesarean section. You can do big fibroid. Extensive laceration, ruptured uterus, and the uterus is badly torn. You end up doing a hysterectomy. Grossly infected uterus or ruptured uterus also. So these are some conditions where you do a hysterectomy after you do a cesarean section. Now, peripartum hysterectomy is terminology is if after a vaginal delivery, if you do a hysterectomy, it includes also hysterectomy done during cesarean section, and also following vaginal delivery, bleeding is not controlled, then the terminology becomes peripartum hysterectomy. So these are also types of hysterectomy which you do along with cesarean section. Now, perimortem cesarean delivery is this patient in the ICU is going to die, and she's expected to die within the next few moments. So they have said that within 10 minutes of the death of the woman, if you can deliver the baby has a chance of survival. So that is what they're trying to do. So they do it in the ICU with the minimal anesthesia. And here you can see there is a midline vertical incision and classical incision being done. And this is a perimortem cesarean delivery. Heroics which are very rarely tried, but still tried in some parts of the world. Yeah. So that completes our topic of cesarean section. Do we have time for the video, Charuta?
Yeah, yes, ma'am.
Okay. So let's go to the video. More on hooking of the head. Hooking of the head is you try to go underneath the head and you elevate the baby's head. So your head tries to go under the lowest part of the head and you deliver the head out. So that's what is hooking of the head. Okay, let's fast forward a little, Charuta. Yeah, can you mute the video, please?
The patient is 31 years old.
Yeah, let's fast forward this. Okay, so painting and draping has been done. So you have painted and draped the abdomen. So this is the fan and steel incision. So the fan and steel incision is 3 centimeters above the level of the pubic symphysis. Skin open, subcutaneous muscle open. This whitish layer is the rectus fascia or the rectus sheath, which also has to be opened transversely. Now, when you open that, you can see the longitudinal muscle fibers, which is the rectus abdominis muscle. You just put your finger and you separate them in the midline. You're not cutting the rectus abdominis. You can see the parietal peritoneum here. Now, the parietal peritoneum has to be opened as high as possible because the bladder comes below. So you open it near the upper part of your incision. One, you will be able to visualize the uterus. Now, near the lower part, that dome which you can see is the bladder. Okay. So you are putting your incision. Before that, the UV fold, the peritoneum has to be opened. So they are making an opening the UV fold. Okay, so they have opened this fold of peritoneum. This is the bladder. Now your Doyen's retractor goes over the UV fold and it is protecting the bladder. So that whatever your incision is you're putting on the uterus now does not come near the bladder. So again, it is a transverse curvilinear incision, curves incision, and you can see the baby's head. Okay, so now the baby's head is visualized. So again, you have to flex the head because flexion gives the smallest diameter. So your hands go in and you flex the head and get it to the incision, and then fundal pressure is given. Your anesthetist gives fundal pressure, pushes on the baby's buttocks, and the head is delivered. Now, before the shoulders are delivered, you're supposed to suction the baby's mouth, deliver the anterior shoulder, deliver the posterior shoulder, and the rest of the body is delivered. Okay, now the baby you place in between the mother's thighs and you clamp and cut the umbilical cord. Okay, so if you need a sample, like if it's an Rh negative, you need to know the baby's blood group, you can collect a cord blood. Placenta is delivered using control cord traction. Okay, now in this video, they have exteriorized, they have removed the uterus out of the peritoneal cavity so that visualization is better and they can suture better. So vicryl is used for continuous locking suture. Okay. So that is how from one end you put a knot and continue to the other end. Second layer buries the first layer of suture. Okay. So 2 layers of suture, we close the uterus. So you put your Doyens in and put the uterus back into the peritoneal cavity, which you had taken it out for suturing. See that there is no bleeding or ooze anywhere from where your suture line is. We do not close the parietal peritoneum. We close the rectus muscle, rectus sheath, closed. Subcutaneous fascia closed. And finally, you close your skin incision. Okay, that is a subcuticular. You don't see any suture material outside. We do a subcuticular closure and then you toy at the vagina. Now, this is in an actual patient. So they have painted and draped the patient. Okay. So 3 centimeters above the pubic symphysis is about 2 finger breadth. Okay. And they're actually measuring how much they need. So at least about 10 centimeters. Usually it will be a 12 centimeters skin incision. The yellowish layer which you can see is the fascia. So skin has been cut, the fascia is cut. Okay. Now they're trying to visualize the rectus sheath. So the next layer which they're going to cut is the rectus sheath. Okay. So this they are cutting the rectus sheath. You can see the reddish layer underneath it, which is the rectus abdominis muscle. So this is still they're cutting the rectus sheath on this side. Okay. It's a whitish layer. So these 2 Aries forceps are put on the rectus sheath and you separate the rectus abdominis from the rectus sheath. You're making more space in the abdomen. Okay. And you cut the attachment of the rectus abdominis muscle to the rectus sheath to get more space. This is not a necessary step, can be done to get more space in the abdomen. Now they have just put their fingers and separated the 2 rectus abdominis muscle. And then now they're going to try to open the peritoneum. Okay. Now peritoneum opening is a tricky part. Okay. If you open it too low, you might enter into the bladder. So this is where you might injure the bladder. And when you're opening it very high, and if you pick up a thick layer of the peritoneum, you might be actually picking up the bowel and you can cause bowel injury when you're cutting like this. So you have to press and feel and take up the thinnest part of the peritoneum and see they're feeling and that there is no bowel in between what they've picked up and they're opening. Some people just prefer to open with their fingers. Okay, blunt method. Now they've opened the parietal peritoneum and you're increasing the incision, you're in the peritoneal cavity. Okay, so they have increased the incision of the parietal peritoneum. Okay, so these are just cuts on the parietal peritoneum. You're making space to enter the peritoneal cavity. So they just stretch with the hands on both sides. You're in the cavity. What you can see now is the uterus. Okay, so to protect the bladder, the instrument which they use, they call it the Balfours. We are using something called as the Doyens retractor. Okay, so now with the artery, what they have picked up is the vesico-uterine peritoneum or the utero-vesical fold of peritoneum. Okay, so you open this fold of peritoneum to separate the connection between the uterus and the bladder. So this is a peritoneum which is going onto the bladder. Blood vessels you can see, it is going to be vascular. So they are just separating, they have made a cut on the, this is the visceral peritoneum of the uterus. So this peritoneum separates the uterus and the bladder. So they are separating this peritoneum, still the lower part of the peritoneum. Now your Doyens retractor is going to come over and above this peritoneum. So your bladder gets protected. Okay, so they're going to move the retractor over this peritoneum. Okay, so now what you can see is just the lower uterine segment. Okay, your yeah, so this is how your retractor is protecting the bladder. The bladder comes under the surface of the retractor and does not come into your line of incision. Okay, so your retractor is in place. You have protected the bladder. Now is your delivery of infant, the Kerr's incision. So first you take your scalpel and put a small nick on the uterine cavity. Okay, so this is like an elective cesarean section. So it's a thick segment. If it's an emergency, it will be a very thin segment and you, with a single nick, you will be able to enter. Okay, so this is the direction, as I told you, it's again curvilinear and it has to be upwards to prevent injury to the uterine arteries. If you go transversely, you will injure the uterine arteries. So they will open this incision until they see the bag of membranes. Okay. Yeah, you can see the bag of membranes now. Okay. So the bag of membranes is visible. Now they will rupture the membranes and suction out the amniotic fluid. So they have extended the incision. They have made an incision on the lower uterine segment, the Kerr's incision. And you can see so this instrument is called the Cocker's forceps. And they have ruptured the membranes, and you can see the black hair, the baby's head. So this is how you hook your fingers, palmar surface under the fetal head, and elevate the head to the level of the incision and flex the head. Flex it and elevate it to the level of the incision. Okay. Yeah, so that elevating of head to the level of incision is done, and the head has come to the level. Once the head comes to that, fundal pressure is being given, and the baby's head is elevated. So they have given fundal pressure there. Yeah, now they're delivering the shoulders, anterior shoulder. They're trying to deliver first. Okay, at this point, if there is some loop of cord around the neck, they remove the loop, deliver the posterior shoulder, baby out. Okay, so suctioning should be done for the baby, and clamping and cutting of the cord is done and given to the pediatrician. Okay, and the pediatrician has to look. Now in this, they're collecting the cord. Now there is a lot of stem cell research going on, and they save the baby's umbilical cord for future if the baby needs it for any stem cell, for the stem cells for any conditions like cancer, if the baby needs the cord. So they save the baby's cord. So the placenta is delivered, and now they're pulling the uterus out of the peritoneal cavity to suture it. So a mop covers the uterus, and they're cleaning the cavity so that no membranes will remain inside that can cause PPH. Now they're holding, with this instrument they're holding, it's called green Armitage forceps. Again, your retractor goes in to protect the bladder so you don't accidentally suture the bladder. So you start suturing with your Vicryl, which is a continuous locking suture. So you put a knot on one end and continuously start taking bites and put the suture on the knot on the other end. Okay. So that is the suturing of the uterus which they are doing. So this is a continuous locking sutures which they follow using the Vicryl. Okay, so this is the first knot which they put. So this technique where they suture the angles. So angles usually bleed more. We don't usually follow this technique. Here they take 2 stitches at the angle and then they start suturing the uterus. What we do is we put a knot at one angle and start continuously coming towards the other angle and put a knot at the other angle. This they have taken the angles first and then started suturing. So they have sutured. This is the first layer of suturing of the uterine cavity closed. This is called continuous locking sutures. The suture material is a delayed absorbable suture material, which is Vicryl. Okay, first layer of suturing is done. Okay, perfect hemostasis is obtained. Now there has to be a second layer which buries the first suture layer. So 2 layers gives more strength to the uterus and protects against scar rupture. Okay, so buried first layer. Okay, can we fast forward this a little, Charuta? So they are doing this second layer suturing where the first layer is getting buried for additional strength. Yeah, let's fast forward this a little more. So burying of the suture, second layer done. So this is how the uterus looks after they have put 2 layers of sutures on the uterus. Okay. So suturing of the uterus is done. They check for hemostasis and they suction out and clean whatever blood is there in the peritoneal cavity. See, look at the tubes and ovaries. See if there is any ovarian cyst or any abnormality. Remove whatever mops they have kept inside and check for mop and instrument count. And then put the uterus back into the cavity. Again, look for any bleeding from the uterine incision suture inside. After they've confirmed there is no bleeding, they cut the extra sutures. And then we remove the retractor and confirm the mop count. Confirm that how many mops were used in the beginning and all the mops are out. So here they are putting alleys on the rectus sheath and they're suturing back. Now you can see all the layers. So skin, subcutaneous, fascia. Okay. So they are directly going to suture the rectus sheath in this video. Okay. So they don't even close the rectus abdominis muscle. We put an approximating suture of the rectus abdominis. There are 2 layers of the rectus sheath. The rectus sheath is nothing but the aponeurosis of the external oblique, internal oblique, and the rectus abdominis, which has come together. So then they are closing the rectus sheath. Can we fast forward this a little? Okay, so they have finished suturing of the rectus sheath over here. Okay, then they're closing the subcutaneous fascia. And finally, they are suturing the skin. So this, you will not be able to see any suture material outside. This is called subcuticular suturing. Okay, this is a very cosmetic kind of suture. They're putting surgical adhesive tapes and finally dressing the wound. Yeah, we can end the video. This is followed up by vaginal toileting.
Ma'am, I think we have 2 questions on the forum.
Why is clamping important was the question. Clamping is important on the baby side because we don't want the baby to lose blood. Okay, till there is thrombosis in the cord blood vessels, it might lose blood through the cord if we don't clamp it. So we need to clamp it on the baby side. On the mother side, we clamp it because if there is an unidentified twin, if you're not clamped the cord, because of the bleeding, the other undiagnosed twin might get examined. That's why we clamp it on the mother side. So that's why clamping of the cord is important. When we exteriorize the uterus for its suturing, no, it does not disrupt the uterine supports. It's not a known cause for prolapse, but some people are not in favor of exteriorizing. More chance of infection because we're getting it outside the peritoneal cavity, and the patient also slightly feels pain because of the stretch on the ligaments. VBAC. Cesarean section itself has taken more than 1.5 hours, and I didn't have time actually to touch on VBAC. Yeah, so there are a lot of criteria for VBAC of why the section was done, whether 18 months have passed since the previous cesarean, and what is the indication of the cesarean. Okay, so all that is important when you decide on whether you're going to do a VBAC this time. How placental cords are stored for stem cell? They store it in a special solution. And there are companies which have come up for this, where you have to pay a certain amount of money every year to save your baby's cord and cord blood, which can be kept for almost like 25-30 years. So in case the baby or the baby's siblings have any abnormality where you might need to make a new liver for the baby, or you need to make new kidneys, you can use this. And so that is the future. So where you can use it to make organs, and if the baby needs it or the baby siblings need it, that's why they store the umbilical cord and the umbilical cord blood, which is rich in stem cells.
Okay, ma'am, I think the questions are over.
Okay, John.
Okay. So thank you so much, ma'am, for this splendid session. I'm sure every single person in the audience has learned a lot of new things today.
Yes.
And I don't think we have any more questions. So once again, thank you, ma'am, for a wonderful learning experience. It was so much fun and as well as so educational. It was an absolute honor to have you on board for this webinar series, ma'am, and we cannot thank you enough for being the most patient and most wonderful teacher ever.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. It was a very enthusiastic audience too. And a lot of work has gone into this from all of you. And I would like to thank all of you from SNO Karnataka and Madhya Pradesh, and my own students from Navodaya, Sushant, Vibha, and all of them. Thanks for the opportunity. It was wonderful interacting with you. See you. Bye-bye.